The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Clarence's house, casting long shadows across the polished floors. King Charles sat at his mahogany desk, his fingers drumming a quiet rhythm on the leather surface. The weight of the crown had always been heavy, but nothing prepared him for the burden that came with protecting his wife from those who should have been her closest allies. Camilla stood by the window, her shoulders tense beneath her elegant cream blazer. She gazed out at the gardens, but her mind was clearly elsewhere. For years she had endured the scrutiny, the criticism, the endless comparisons. She had weathered storms that would have broken lesser souls. But this latest betrayal cut deeper than any tabloid headline ever could. It started 3 weeks earlier at what was supposed to be a private family dinner. Tom Parker Bowles, Camilla's son, had arranged the gathering at his London home. The guest list was small, intimate, just close family, he had promised. Charles and Camilla arrived, expecting a quiet evening, a chance to relax away from the relentless public eye that followed their every move. But the evening took an unexpected turn when the conversation shifted to recent media coverage. Laura Lopes, Camilla's daughter, mentioned an upcoming interview she had agreed to give. She spoke casually about it, as if discussing the weather. But Charles noticed the way Camilla's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her wine glass. He noticed the sudden silence that fell over the table. The details emerged slowly, reluctantly. The interview would cover family life, childhood memories, growing up with a mother who would one day become queen consort. It all sounded innocent enough on the surface. But Charles had lived in this world long enough to know how these things worked. He had watched his own family's private moments become public spectacles. He had seen how carefully chosen words could be twisted, how innocent anecdotes could become weapons in the hands of those seeking sensational headlines. What troubled him most was not the interview itself, but what it represented. No one had consulted Camilla. No one had asked if she was comfortable with her children discussing their family life in such a public forum. The decision had been made without her input, without her consent. And when Charles pressed for more information, he learned that certain private matters, sensitive topics from years past, would be part of the discussion that night. As they drove back to Clarence's house, Camilla was unusually quiet. Charles reached across the seat and took her hand. She managed a smile, but he could see the hurt in her eyes. She had sacrificed so much to be by his side. She had endured decades of public criticism, had been painted as the villain in a story she'd never asked to be part of. And through it all, she had maintained her dignity, had never spoken ill of anyone, had simply tried to live her life with grace and honor. Now her own children seemed ready to profit from the very publicity she had spent years trying to avoid. The realization was devastating. Charles could see it weighing on her, could feel the way her hand gripped his just a little tighter than usual. He made a decision in that moment, sitting in the back of the royal car as it glided through the London streets. He would not let this happen. Not to her. Not anymore. The following morning, Charles made several phone calls. He spoke with his private secretary, with his legal advisors, with those who understood the delicate balance between family and duty. He listened to their counsel, weighed the options, considered the consequences. But his mind was already made up. Some lines could not be crossed. Some boundaries had to be protected by afternoon. Messages were sent to Tom and Laura. The wording was carefully chosen, diplomatic but firm. The interview would not proceed as planned. Certain topics were off limits. If they chose to continue with the media engagement, they would need to understand that there would be consequences. Not dramatic or vindictive consequences, but clear boundaries that would define their relationship with the royal household moving forward. The response came quickly, and was not what Charles had hoped for. Tom called first, his voice tight with frustration. He argued that they were simply trying to share their story, that they had every right to speak about their own experiences. Laura followed with a longer, more emotional conversation. She felt they were being controlled, silenced, prevented from living their own lives. Charles listened patiently to both. He understood their perspective. Truly he did. But they were not understanding his. They were not seeing how their mother was affected by all of this. They were not considering the position she held now, the responsibilities that came with being queen consort. Most importantly, they were not recognizing the pain they were causing, someone who had always put their needs before her own. That evening, Clarence's house was unusually quiet. Staff moved through the halls with hushed efficiency, sensing the tension that hung in the air like a physical presence. Charles found Camilla in the library, a book open in her lap but clearly unread. She looked up as he entered, and he could see she had been crying. In all their years together, through all the trials they had faced, he had rarely seen her shed tears. But now they glistened in her eyes, threatening to spill over. He walked over and sat beside her, taking both her hands in his. They did not need words in that moment. The bond between them had always been deeper than what could be expressed through language. But Charles spoke anyway, because he needed her to know, needed her to understand the depths of his commitment to her well-being. He told her about the conversations, about the boundaries he had set. He expected her to protest, to tell him he was being too harsh, too controlling. That was who she was, always thinking of others, always putting family first. But instead, she simply squeezed his hands and rested her head on his shoulder. The gesture said everything. She was tired. Tired of fighting, tired of defending herself, tired of being the strong one. The next few days were difficult. News of the canceled interview leaked to the press, as such things inevitably do. The headlines were predictable. Speculation ran wild about rifts in the family, about controlling behavior, about power struggles within the royal household. Charles watched it all with a weary resignation. This was the price of drawing a line. This was what happened when you protected those you loved. What surprised him was the support that emerged from unexpected quarters. Several members of the extended royal family reached out privately, expressing their understanding. They too had dealt with the challenge of maintaining privacy while living in the public eye. They too had struggled with family members who did not quite grasp the unique pressures that came with royal life. Princess Anne called one afternoon. She was characteristically direct. She told Charles he had done the right thing, that boundaries were essential, especially when it came to protecting those we love. She shared her own experiences. Times when she had to make difficult decisions about what was shared publicly and what remained private. Her words carried weight, coming from someone who had navigated these waters for decades. But the silence from Tom and Laura was deafening. Days turned into a week, then two. Camilla checked her phone constantly, hoping for a message, a call. Any sign that her children wanted to bridge the gap that had opened between them. Charles watched her heart break a little more each day. He began to question his own actions. Had he been too harsh? Had he overstepped? Was protecting Camilla worth potentially destroying her relationship with her children? Late one night, unable to sleep, he found himself in the study, reviewing everything that had happened. He thought about his own mother, about the way she had navigated family drama throughout her long reign. She had always maintained a certain distance, a professional detachment that protected the institution, even when it meant sacrificing personal relationships. Charles had witnessed the cost of that approach, had seen how it had affected his own family. He did not want to make the same mistakes. But he also could not stand by and watch Camilla be hurt by those who should have been protecting her. There had to be a middle ground, a way to maintain boundaries while keeping family connections intact. The question was how to find it. The answer came from an unexpected source. Mark Boland, a former deputy private secretary who had worked closely with Charles during some of the most challenging periods of his relationship with Camilla, reached out. He had heard about the situation through the inevitable palace gossip network. His advice was simple but profound. Sometimes, he said, the best way to move forward was to step back. Let them process their feelings, he suggested. Let them come to understand on their own terms why these boundaries were necessary. Forcing a resolution would only deepen the divide. Time, patience, an unwavering consistency in maintaining the boundaries set would eventually lead to either acceptance or a clear understanding that certain paths were closed. Charles shared this. Conversation with Camilla. She listened quietly, then asked a question that had clearly been weighing on her mind. What if they never came around? What if this was the price of her position, the sacrifice required for wearing the crown? What if she had to choose between being queen consort and being a mother? The pain in her voice was almost unbearable. Charles pulled her close, holding her as she finally allowed herself to truly cry. She had been so strong for so long, had weathered so many storms with such grace and dignity. But even the strongest people have their breaking points. Even queens need to be allowed their moments of weakness. He promised her that she would never have to choose. He would find a way to make this work. To maintain the boundaries necessary for her protection, while keeping the door open for reconciliation. It was a difficult promise to make, perhaps an impossible one to keep. But he meant it with every fiber of his being. The following morning brought a small but significant development. Tom sent a text message. It was brief, almost curt, but it was communication. He wanted to talk, he said. Not to argue or to negotiate, but simply to understand. Charles saw the message on Camilla's phone and watched hope flicker in her eyes. It was not much, but it was something. A crack in the wall of silence, a possibility that healing might be possible after all. The meeting was arranged for the following Tuesday at a private location, away from prying eyes. Charles suggested it be just Camilla and Tom, initially, giving them space to speak openly, without the weight of royal protocol hanging over every word. But Tom requested that both Charles and Laura be present. He wanted everyone involved to hear what he had to say. They gathered in a sitting room at Highgrove, Charles and Camilla's country estate. The choice of location was deliberate. This was a place filled with happy memories, with family gatherings and celebrations. It was neutral ground in a way that Clarence House or Buckingham Palace could never be. The gardens visible through the windows were in full bloom, a reminder that even in difficult times, beauty and growth were possible. Tom spoke first. He was visibly uncomfortable, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He apologized, not for wanting to share his story, but for the way he had gone about it. He admitted that he had not fully considered the impact on his mother, had not understood the delicate position she occupied. He had seen it simply as an opportunity, a chance to share their family's journey in their own words, rather than letting others control the narrative. But he had learned something important over the past few weeks. Privacy was not just about protecting secrets or hiding uncomfortable truths. It was about respect. It's about recognizing that some stories belong to multiple people and required collective consent before being shared. His mother's story was not his alone to tell. Every word he spoke about their family life inevitably affected her, shaped public perception of her, influenced how she was viewed in her role as queen consort. Laura spoke next, her voice thick with emotion. She had been angry at first, she admitted, angry at what she perceived as interference in her life, at boundaries she saw as controlling rather than protective. But time and distance had given her perspective. She had spoken with friends who lived in the public eye, the people who understood the unique challenges of being connected to royalty. They had helped her see things differently. She looked at her mother as she spoke, tears sliding down her cheeks. She apologized for not seeing the burden Camilla carried every day. She had watched her mother handle criticism and scrutiny with grace for years. But she had never truly understood the toll it took. She had never fully grasped how exhausting it was to be constantly judged, constantly analyzed, constantly picked apart by people who knew nothing about the real woman behind the title. Camilla rose from her seat and went to her daughter. She held Laura as they both cried, years of unspoken tension finally finding release. Charles felt his own throat tighten with emotion. This was what he had hoped for, what he had fought for. Not perfect resolution, not instant healing, but honest communication and genuine understanding. When they had all composed themselves, Charles spoke. He acknowledged that his approach might have seemed heavy-handed. He explained that his only goal had been to protect Camilla, to give her the space and peace that should have been her right all along. But he also recognized that in his determination to shield her, he might have moved too quickly, might have failed to give Tom and Laura a chance to understand on their own terms. Tom asked a question that had clearly been troubling him. Were they never to speak publicly about their family? Were they expected to simply pretend that whole chapters of their lives did not exist? It was a fair question, and Charles appreciated the directness. He thought carefully before responding. The answer, he explained, was not about silencing them. It was about collaboration and consideration. If they wanted to share stories from their childhood, from their experiences growing up, there had to be consultation. Camilla needed to be involved in those decisions, needed to have input into what was shared and how it was presented. This was not about control. It was about respect for someone who had sacrificed more than any of them fully understood. Laura suggested a practical approach. Before any media engagement that involved family matters, they would discuss it together. They would consider the potential impact, the likely interpretation, the possible consequences. And if Camilla was uncomfortable with any aspect, they would either modify the approach or decline the opportunity altogether. It was a compromise, but it felt fair to everyone in the room. The conversation continued for hours, moving from the specific issue at hand to broader discussions about family, duty, and the unique challenges of their situation. There were moments of tension, times when old hurts surfaced and had to be acknowledged and addressed. But there was also laughter, shared memories, reminders of the love that bound them together despite the complications as afternoon faded into evening. They moved to the dining room for a simple meal. The atmosphere was lighter than it had been in weeks. Not everything was resolved, and there were still details to work out, understandings to solidify. But the fundamental breach had been mended. The family was intact, perhaps even stronger for having weathered this storm together. That night, as Charles and Camilla prepared for bed, she thanked him. Not for drawing the line, though she appreciated that, but for having the courage to do what she could not do for herself, for valuing her peace and well-being enough to risk family harmony, for seeing her not just as queen consort, but as a woman who deserved protection and respect. The weeks that followed brought a noticeable shift in the atmosphere at Clarence's house. Staff members who had grown accustomed to Camilla's quiet melancholy noticed a lightness returning to her step. She smiled more readily, laughed more freely. The weight that had pressed down on her shoulders seemed to have lifted, at least partially. Tom and Laura made efforts to rebuild the relationship that had been strained by recent events. Tom came for lunch one afternoon, just him and his mother. Sitting in the small private dining room where they could talk without formality or pretense, they spoke about his work, his children, the ordinary details of life that had somehow gotten lost in the drama of recent weeks. Laura invited both, Charles and Camilla, to her home for a family dinner. Her husband and children were there, creating a buffer of normalcy that helped ease any lingering tension. Charles watched as Camilla played with her grandchildren, saw the joy in her face as she read them stories, and listened to their excited chatter. This was who she was at her core, he realized. Not queen consort, not public figure, but grandmother. Mother. Woman who loved her family fiercely. But the story was not over. The incident had attracted attention from other quarters, raising questions about how the royal family managed relationships with extended family members. Several relatives reached out to Charles seeking clarification about boundaries and expectations. Some were supportive, understanding the need to protect privacy and dignity. Others were resentful, seeing the situation as an overreach of royal authority into personal lives. One particularly difficult conversation came from a distant cousin who had recently published a memoir, touching on various royal connections. She called Charles directly, bypassing normal protocols, demanding to know if the new boundaries applied to her as well. Her book had already been published. She was considering a follow-up volume and wanted to know where she stood. Charles handled the call with diplomatic care. He explained that the situation with Tom and Laura was specific to their unique position as children of the queen consort. He could not and would not attempt to control what distant relatives chose to share about their own experiences. But he made it clear that anyone who used their connection to the royal family for commercial gain while causing distress to working members of the family would face consequences in terms of their relationship with the household. The conversation was tense, ending without complete resolution. But it highlighted a larger issue that Charles had been pondering since the situation with Tom and Laura first arose. Where exactly did royal authority begin and end when it came to family members who were not themselves working royals? It was a question that had no easy answers. Complicated by centuries of tradition meeting modern media realities, he convened a meeting with his most trusted advisors. They discussed historical precedents, legal considerations, practical implications. The consensus was that while Charles could not prevent anyone from speaking publicly, he could control access to royal events, royal properties, and royal support. Those who chose to profit from family connections while causing harm could find themselves gradually excluded from the inner circle. It was not a perfect solution, and it carried risks. There would be accusations of being heavy-handed, of trying to silence legitimate voices. The media would have a field day analyzing every nuance, every implication. But Charles felt it was necessary. The monarchy had survived for over 1,000 years by adapting to changing times while maintaining core principles. One of those principles was loyalty, mutual respect within the family unit. A formal policy was drafted, reviewed by legal teams, and eventually approved by Charles. It outlined expectations for extended family members, clarifying what was appropriate and what crossed boundaries. The document was distributed quietly, without fanfare or public announcement. Those who needed to know received copies. Those who did not need to know remained unaware. The immediate family response was mixed. Some appreciated the clarity, the explicit boundaries that removed ambiguity. Others bristled at what they perceived as new restrictions on their freedom. But most understood, at least intellectually, why such measures were necessary. The world had changed. Social media and 24-hour news cycles meant that private comments could become public scandals in moments. Boundaries were not about control. They were about survival. Through all of this, Camilla remained remarkably composed. She attended her official engagements with her usual grace, smiled for cameras, shook hands, made small talk. But Charles could see the effort it cost her. Every public appearance was now colored by awareness that her family dynamics were being scrutinized, analyzed, discussed by millions of people who had never met her. One evening, she asked him a question that had clearly been troubling her. Had she ruined everything by marrying him? Had her decision to be with Charles destroyed her relationship with her children, complicated their lives in ways that could never be undone? The anguish in her voice was heartbreaking. Charles took her face in his hands and looked directly into her eyes. He told her that she had saved him, had given him a reason to keep going through the darkest periods of his life. Her love had been his anchor, his safe harbor in storms that threatened to overwhelm him. Whatever challenges they faced together were worth it, because being without her would be unbearable. Her children would come to understand that in time, and if they did not, well, that was their loss, not hers. As summer gave way to autumn, a new challenge emerged. Tom had been approached by a documentary filmmaker interested in creating a series about food culture and family heritage. The project would include segments about his childhood, his relationship with cooking, and how his mother had influenced his culinary journey. It was exactly the kind of opportunity he had wanted before, framed in a way that seemed innocent and personal. This time, however, Tom approached it differently. He called his mother first, before making any commitments. He explained the concept, shared the production company's vision, and asked for her thoughts. It was a small gesture, but it represented a significant shift in his thinking. He was no longer viewing his story as separate from hers. He recognized that their lives were intertwined in ways that required consideration and respect. Camilla was touched by the consultation. They met for coffee at his London flat, reviewing the proposal together. She had concerns about certain aspects, particular periods of their family history that felt too raw, too personal to share with strangers. Tom listened carefully, taking notes, asking questions to better understand her perspective. Together, they crafted boundaries around what would and would not be discussed. The production company was remarkably accommodating. They understood the delicate nature of Tom's position as son of the Queen Consort. They agreed to focus primarily on his professional journey, his expertise in food culture, with only brief, carefully controlled references to his family background. The result would be authentic without being invasive, personal without being exploitative. Charles watched this development with quiet satisfaction. This was what he had hoped for when he first drew the line weeks earlier. Not silence, not erasure of family connections, but thoughtful collaboration that honored everyone involved. Tom was still able to pursue his passions and opportunities. Camilla was protected from unwanted exposure. The family relationship was preserved and even strengthened. Laura, too, found her own path forward. She had been invited to patron a charity focused on art education for underprivileged children. The role would involve public appearances and media coverage, inevitably raising questions about her royal connections. She approached Camilla and Charles together, seeking guidance on how to handle the attention without compromising family privacy. The conversation was productive and forward-looking. They discussed strategies for deflecting intrusive questions, ways to acknowledge her family ties without making them the focus of every interaction. Charles shared techniques he had learned over decades of managing public interest while maintaining personal boundaries. Camilla offered her own insights, hard-won wisdom from years of navigating similar challenges. What emerged from these interactions was a new family dynamic, one built on mutual respect and clear communication. Tom and Laura began to see their mother not just as family, but as someone occupying a unique and challenging position. They understood that their choices had ripple effects, that their words could impact her in ways they had not previously considered. Similarly, Camilla began to trust that her children understood the complexities of her situation. She could share her concerns without fear of being dismissed or resented. She could ask for consideration without feeling like she was imposing restrictions on their lives. The relationship was healing, growing stronger through honest dialogue and genuine effort on all sides. The broader royal family took notice of these positive developments. Several members privately reached out to Charles, acknowledging that his approach, while initially controversial, had resulted in a healthier family dynamic. Princess Anne, in particular, expressed admiration for how he had balanced firmness with compassion, setting boundaries while leaving room for growth and reconciliation. But not everyone was pleased with the outcome. Some media outlets, disappointed by the lack of ongoing drama, began speculating about other potential conflicts. They scrutinized every royal event, looking for signs of tension or discord. When Tom and Laura both attended a state dinner at Buckingham Palace, photographers captured every glance, every interaction, searching for evidence of the rumored rift. What they found instead was a family that appeared comfortable with each other. Charles and Tom were photographed in animated conversation during the reception. Laura and Camilla stood together during the formal dinner, at ease in each other's company. The images told a story of reconciliation and healing. Though the headlines often tried to suggest otherwise, Charles learned to ignore most of the speculation. Years in the public eye had taught him that truth and perception rarely aligned in the media. What mattered was the reality they were living, the genuine progress being made behind palace walls. The family was finding its way forward, and that was what counted one crisp November morning. As Charles and Camilla walked through the gardens at Highgrove, she thanked him again for standing firm months earlier. She could see now, she said, that his actions had been necessary. The initial pain had given way to a deeper understanding among all of them. Their family was stronger now, built on a foundation of respect rather than just affection. It was a better way forward, even if getting there had been difficult. As winter settled over London, bringing with it the festive preparations that consumed the royal household each year, Charles reflected on how much had changed since that difficult evening months ago. When he first made the decision to draw a line with Camilla's family, the journey had not been easy, and there were still occasional bumps along the road. But the fundamental shift in understanding and respect was undeniable. The family gathered at Sandringham for Christmas. As tradition dictated, this year Tom and Laura were included in more of the private celebrations, a privilege that reflected their renewed commitment to respecting family boundaries. Their children ran through the grand halls with their cousins, innocent of the adult complications that had threatened to tear their family apart just months before. On Christmas Eve, after the formal dinner, the adults gathered in the drawing room for coffee and conversation. The atmosphere was relaxed, warm. Tom shared stories about his latest culinary adventures, making everyone laugh with his descriptions of kitchen disasters and unexpected successes. Laura spoke about the charity work she had taken on, her eyes bright with genuine enthusiasm. Charles watched Camilla throughout the evening. She was radiant, truly happy in a way he had not seen in far too long. Her laughter was genuine, her smiles reaching her eyes. This was the woman he had fallen in love with decades ago, the one who had weathered every storm with grace and dignity. Seeing her like this, surrounded by family who finally understood and respected her position, filled him with deep satisfaction. Later that night, as they prepared for bed in their private chambers, Camilla shared something she had been thinking about. She said that the difficult months had taught her an important lesson about allowing others to protect you. For years, she had been so determined to be strong, to never ask for help or support, to simply endure whatever came her way. She had seen it as weakness to admit when something hurt, when something was too much to bear alone. But watching Charles stand up for her, seeing him willing to face family conflict rather than let her continue to suffer in silence, had changed her perspective. Strength, she realized, was not about enduring everything alone. It was about knowing when to accept help, when to let others share the burden. It was about recognizing that love meant allowing yourself to be protected, just as much as it meant protecting others. Charles held her hand as she spoke, humbled by her words. He had acted out of love and a desperate need to ease her pain. He had not expected that his actions would lead to such profound personal growth, not just for Tom and Laura, but for Camilla herself. Life, he thought, had a way of bringing unexpected gifts, even through difficult circumstances. The new year brought fresh challenges, as New Year's always do. There were official duties to fulfill, public appearances to make, endless meetings and obligations that filled their calendars. But through it all, the family dynamic remained strong. Tom consulted with his mother before accepting media opportunities. Laura kept Charles and Camilla informed about her charity work and public engagements. The communication was open, honest, respectful. There were still moments of tension, times when old habits threatened to resurface. But everyone had learned how to navigate those moments now. They talked through concerns rather than letting them fester. They addressed issues promptly rather than hoping they would resolve themselves. They had developed tools for healthy communication, and they used them. One afternoon in February, Charles received a letter from a woman who had followed the public narrative of the family situation. She wrote that she had been dealing with similar dynamics in her own family, with children who did not understand the boundaries she needed to maintain in her professional life. Reading about how the royal family had worked through their challenges had given her hope and courage to address her own situation. The letter moved Charles deeply. He had not thought much about how their private struggles might affect others. He had been so focused on protecting Camilla, on maintaining family harmony, that he had not considered the broader implications. But this woman's words reminded him that even kings and queens face human problems, that the challenges they navigate are not so different from those faced by families everywhere. He shared the letter with Camilla that evening. She was equally touched, and they talked about the unexpected ways their lives touched others. Every decision they made, every challenge they faced, was watched and analyzed by millions. It was a heavy responsibility, but it also meant they had opportunities to set examples, to show that difficult family dynamics could be navigated with love and respect. As spring arrived, bringing with it the renewal that comes with changing seasons, Charles looked back on the journey they had traveled since that initial crisis. Drawing the line had been necessary, even though it had caused pain in the short term. Sometimes love meant being willing to face conflict, to stand firm on principles, to protect those who could not always protect themselves. But equally important was what came after: the willingness to listen, to compromise, to find solutions that honored everyone's needs, the courage to have difficult conversations and work through complex emotions, the commitment to building something stronger from the ashes of conflict. The royal residence was no longer gripped by stillness and tension. Instead, it hummed with life and warmth. All had been transformed, not through dramatic gestures or grand declarations, but through the quiet, persistent work of people choosing to love each other better, to understand each other more deeply, to build a family that could weather any storm together. And in that transformation, Charles found a peace he had been seeking for far longer than he had realized.